This is the reason you bought something last week that you didn't need, couldn't explain, and maybe still haven't taken out of the bag. 6 psychological mechanisms are working against your wallet right now, and every single one of them was identified by researchers who won Nobel Prizes, ran fMRI machines, or spent decades watching people shop. Most people assume overspending comes down to discipline, that the fix is willpower, that you just need to grind your teeth and resist the urge. The actual science points somewhere very different. Your brain isn't broken, it's doing exactly what it was built to do, and a $100 billion retail industry has figured out how to exploit that architecture. Today we're walking through each of those 6 mechanisms, the real neuroscience and the real-world tactics layered on top of it. At the end, I'll hand you the specific strategies that researchers have actually tested for interrupting these patterns. No budgeting spreadsheets, and no guilt, just an understanding of how your own mind operates, so you can stop working against it. We start with the one everybody thinks they understand, but almost nobody actually does. Back in 2007, a Stanford neuroscientist named Brian Knudsen put 26 people inside an fMRI scanner and gave each of them $40 real. Products appeared on screen one at a time, followed by the price, and the subjects had to decide whether to buy or pass. Knudsen called it the SHOP task, which stood for Save, Holdings, or Purchase. What came out of that study reshaped how we think about spending. A region called the nucleus accumbens lit up whenever subjects saw a product they wanted, and that's the brain's reward anticipation center, the same region that activates for food, sex, and drugs. But here's the thing, when the price appeared and it felt too high, a completely different region fired called the insula, which is your pain center. A third area, the mesial prefrontal cortex, acted as the tiebreaker by weighing the want against the pain. Knudsen could predict whether someone would buy or pass just by watching which region won, not from what they told him they'd do, but from their brain activity seconds before the actual decision. And this is the part that matters for your bank account. That reward center, the nucleus accumbens, doesn't fire the most when you get it. Peak activation happens when you're anticipating getting it. That pattern traces back to foundational work by Wolfram Schultz at Cambridge in 1997, who was studying dopamine neurons in primates and discovered that those neurons don't just respond to rewards, they respond to the prediction of rewards. Once a reward becomes predictable from a cue, dopamine shifts away from the reward itself and onto the cue. Put that in shopping terms and the picture gets uncomfortable fast. Browsing fires more dopamine than unboxing, adding to cart fires more than checkout, and watching the tracking notification move from shipped to out for delivery fires more than opening the package. The chase is the drug, and the purchase is the come down. Online shopping is built on this loop. Every scroll delivers a new potential cue, every product page functions as an anticipation engine, and every flash sale or back-in-stock email or push notification fires the prediction reward system all over again. Researchers are careful to point out that fMRI measures blood flow rather than dopamine directly, so we should be precise about what the science shows versus the popular summary. But the core pattern is well replicated across multiple labs. The anticipation phase is where the neural action happens, not the moment you own the thing. And that's exactly what the rest of this video unpacks, because every technique coming up exploits that anticipation window. 2 psychologists named Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman ran an experiment in 1974 that would eventually help Kahneman win the Nobel Prize. Subjects spun a wheel of fortune, rigged to land on either 10 or 65, and then the researchers asked them what percentage of African countries belonged to the United Nations. People who saw 10 guessed a median of 25%, while people who saw 65 guessed 45%. A completely random, irrelevant number shifted their estimate by 20 points, and offering cash prizes for accuracy didn't reduce the effect at all. That's anchoring. The first number you encounter sets a reference point, and every judgment after it bends toward that number, even when the anchor has nothing to do with what you're evaluating. Now carry that into a store. Dan Ariely at MIT ran a study in 2003 with 55 MBA students and asked them to write down the last 2 digits of their social security number before bidding real money on 6 products, including a wireless keyboard, 2 bottles of wine, and Belgian chocolates. Students whose digits fell in the top 20% valued a cordless keyboard at $55, while students in the bottom 20% valued the same keyboard at $16. A meaningless number had created a 216% gap in willingness to pay. Ariely called this coherent arbitrariness. Relative preferences made sense. Students consistently valued rare wine above average wine and keyboards above trackballs, but the absolute prices were anchored to noise. This is the reason every retailer on Earth shows you the crossed-out original price next to the sale price. That original number isn't there to show you what the item used to cost. It exists to set the anchor so the sale price registers as a steal. And we know exactly what happens when you strip those anchors away, because one company tried it and nearly collapsed. Ron Johnson, the guy who built a famous tech company's retail stores, became CEO of a major department store chain in January 2012 and looked at their constant cycle of inflated prices and fake markdowns with disgust. His solution was called fair and square pricing. No coupons, no fake sales, just everyday low prices displayed honestly. The result was a disaster. Comparable store sales dropped 25% in the first year. Revenue fell by roughly $4.3 billion to the lowest level since 1987. The company lost almost $1 billion. Johnson lasted 17 months before being fired, and his own reflection afterward told the whole story. Our core customer was much more dependent on and enjoyed coupons more than I understood. Privately, he had called coupons a drug. That description was accurate, but the drug was anchoring, and you can't cure a psychological mechanism by removing it with nothing in its place. A quieter version of this trick is just as effective. A home goods store once sold a bread maker for $275 that nobody wanted. Their solution wasn't lowering the price. They introduced a bigger model at around $429, and sales of the original nearly doubled. Nobody bought the expensive one. It existed to make the first one feel reasonable. If you've ever noticed that the most expensive item on a restaurant menu is something almost nobody orders, now you know the reason it's there. Tversky and Kahneman didn't stop at anchoring. Their 1979 paper became the most cited publication in the history of the journal Econometrica, and it was called Prospect Theory. The central insight was that people don't evaluate outcomes in terms of what they end up with. They evaluate them as gains or losses relative to where they started. The loss side of that equation hits harder. Their famous phrase was losses loom larger than gains, and their original estimate put the ratio at about 2.25 to 1, meaning losing $100 feels roughly 2.25 times worse than gaining $100 feels good. A 2024 meta-analysis in the Journal of Economic Psychology revised that ratio down to closer to 1.31, but the direction hasn't budged across decades of research. Losing hurts more than gaining feels good. A beautifully simple experiment at Cornell demonstrated the mechanism in action. Researchers randomly gave some students coffee mugs and then set up a market. Students who owned the mugs wanted a median of $7.12 to sell, while students who didn't have them would only pay $2.87 to buy one. Same mug, same students, and the only difference was owning it for a few minutes. That alone was enough to make losing it feel worse than gaining it ever could. Now think about what only 3 left in stock actually means to your brain. It's not inventory information. It's a loss aversion trigger, because if you don't buy now, you lose the option to buy later, and the potential loss of the opportunity registers as worse than the gain of keeping your money. Countdown timers and limited time offer banners feed the same mechanism. A travel booking site used to show only 1 room left at this price, alongside 14 people are looking at this right now. A 2019 UK consumer investigation found that 5 out of 10 of those scarcity claims were flat out inaccurate, including one hotel that showed 1 secret deal room left, while actually having 10 rooms available at a lower price. That February, the UK Competition and Markets Authority forced 6 major hotel booking sites to sign formal undertakings to stop. And it goes well beyond urgency banners. Princeton researchers crawled over 11,000 shopping websites in 2019 and found 1,800 dark pattern instances, with scarcity messaging appearing on more than 600 sites. Several of those sites were running third-party code libraries that fabricated or randomized stock counts and viewer numbers, turnkey fake urgency you could plug into any online store. The largest case landed in September 2025 when a major online retailer settled with the FTC for $2.5 billion, the biggest settlement involving an FTC rule violation in history. The retailer's sign-up and cancellation flow was the target, and their internal name for the cancellation process was the Iliad flow, a multi-page maze built to exploit loss aversion at every step. Internal emails described unwanted subscriptions as an unspoken cancer. The fear of missing a deal is, psychologically speaking, more powerful than the joy of saving that same money. Every scarcity tactic in retail is engineered around that one asymmetry. French philosopher Denis Diderot wrote an essay in 1769 with one of the best titles in the history of philosophy, Regrets on Parting with My Old Dressing Gown. The story behind it goes like this. Diderot received an elegant new scarlet dressing gown, likely connected to the wealth that came after a Russian empress purchased his entire library, and he loved it. But then he looked around his study and realized his straw chair looked shabby next to the new gown, so he replaced it with a leather armchair. The fur bookshelf didn't match, so an inlaid armoire took its place. The wall tapestry went next, then his prints, then his desk. By the end, nearly everything in his study had been replaced to match a single garment, and he was miserable about it. His own words captured the trap perfectly. I was the absolute master of my old robe. I have become the slave of the new one. And in another line, poverty has its freedoms. Opulence has its obstacles. Anthropologist Grant McCracken at the University of Toronto gave this pattern its formal name in 1988, the Diderot Effect. His definition described the way a new possession can trigger a chain of purchases that cascade outward and transform an entire consumption pattern. McCracken called groups of complementary goods Diderot unities, meaning objects that feel culturally matched, and he called the item that starts the chain a bridging good. His marketing insight sounded almost backwards. It is indeed conceivable that it is more useful for a luxury watch brand to advertise for a luxury car brand than for itself. The real sale isn't the watch, it's the unity, the lifestyle set that the watch belongs to. Modern versions of this are everywhere. A major tech company's fiscal year 2024 numbers lay it out clearly. Phone revenue sat at about $201 billion. Wearables, home accessories, and related products added another $37 billion. Services including the App Store, cloud storage, and device protection added $96 billion more. Every phone functions as a bridging good for an entire ecosystem. The wedding industry runs entirely on Diderot unities. The Knott's 2026 Real Wedding Study put the average U.S. wedding cost at $34,200, with the total industry valued at over $100 billion. LendingTree found that 67% of newlyweds took on debt for the wedding. One decision, let's get married, triggers a cascade across venues, photography, catering, flowers, dresses, suits, rings, and honeymoons, where each element has to match the others. Or take a tumbler company. Under a new executive, revenue climbed from roughly $73 million in 2019 to approximately $750 million in 2023, with their signature line surging 275% year over year. Buying one tumbler quickly pulled social media consumers into matching colors, accessories, and replacement lids, all cascading from a water bottle. Economists Marianne Bertrand and Adair Morse studied this at the macro level and found that middle-income households would have saved 2.6 to 3.2% more annually had top incomes not pulled up visible spending norms. Robert Frank called these expenditure cascades, and they operate at every income level. The most dangerous purchase isn't the expensive one. It's the first one in a new category because it resets the unity and everything else follows. Psychologist Leon Festinger published one of the most influential papers in the field in 1954, titled A Theory of Social Comparison Processes. The core idea was simple. When objective standards don't exist, we evaluate ourselves by comparing against other people. That's universal human behavior, and we've always done it. What's changed is the scale. Before social media, your reference group was your neighborhood, your co-workers, maybe your extended family. Now it's everyone. And the comparison isn't against their real lives, it's against their curated highlights. A 2020 study, published in the American Economic Review, ran a randomized controlled trial with over 2,700 social media users, and those who deactivated for 4 weeks showed increased well-being while persistently reducing their usage even after the study ended. The platform was habit-forming in a way that reduced welfare. But the most striking finding on social comparison and money comes from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Economists Agarwal, Meekhead, and Sholnick studied what happens when someone in a small Canadian neighborhood wins the lottery, and a $1,000 increase in the prize led to a 2.4% rise in bankruptcies among the winner's close neighbors. The mechanism was specific. Neighbors increased spending on visible assets like houses, cars, and motorcycles, but not invisible ones like pensions or bank accounts. They weren't trying to get richer, they were trying to look like they hadn't fallen behind. The survey data on social media and spending backs this up. A major financial survey in 2023 of over 3,600 Americans found that 48% of social media users had impulse bought something they saw on social media, with 68% of those buyers regretting at least one purchase. Across all U.S. social media users, the total came to roughly $71 billion in social media-driven impulse purchases over 12 months, with the average buyer spending $754. A 2025 survey found that 57% of Americans say social media has influenced their financial decisions, and 73% say it's changed how they spend, save, or invest. Among Gen Z specifically, 70% reported feeling financial FOMO. Credit Karma found that 76% of Gen Z and 69% of millennials admitted to going into debt because of FOMO, the fear of missing out on experiences or purchases they saw online. And now the comparison engine has a checkout button attached to it. A social commerce platform hit $33.2 billion in global gross merchandise value in 2024. $9 billion of that came from the U.S. alone, a 650% increase year over year, with influencers generating 60% of that U.S. volume. The average American buyer on the platform spends $708 a year at an average order value of about $30, small enough that each purchase barely triggers pain of paying, but large enough in total to matter enormously. This is Festinger's 1954 theory, turbocharged by algorithmic feeds and embedded commerce. You compare, you feel behind, you buy, and that purchase shows up in someone else's feed where the cycle starts again. Everything covered so far explains how your brain works. This section is about how the retail industry reverse engineers that knowledge into physical spaces and digital interfaces. Start with stores. A consumer researcher who studied in-store behavior for decades using video tracking identified something called the decompression zone, which is the first 5 to 15 paces inside any retail store. Shoppers essentially ignore everything in this zone because the brain is still adjusting from outside to inside, which is why most major retailers put nothing of value near the entrance. The researcher also documented what he called the invariant right, the tendency of American shoppers to reflexively turn right when entering, which is why the highest margin departments usually sit to the right. His observation of the butt brush effect, the finding that shoppers will abandon merchandise if bumped from behind in a narrow aisle, especially women, has reshaped store layouts across the industry. Then there's the role of music. A researcher ran a 9-week field study in a supermarket in 1982 testing slow music, fast music, and no music. Slow tempo under 72 beats per minute generated average daily gross sales of $16,740, while fast tempo above 94 BPM pulled in $12,113. That's a 38% lift from slower music, and most customers reported they hadn't noticed the music at all. A university researcher tested something even stranger in 1997 by playing French accordion music and German folk music on alternating days near a wine display in a UK supermarket. French music days produced 40 French bottles sold versus 8 German, while German music days flipped it to 22 German versus 12 French. Most shoppers, when surveyed, claimed the music hadn't influenced them at all. The priming was completely non-conscious. Store layout itself works as a psychological tool. An Austrian architect who designed the first fully enclosed climate-controlled mall in the United States in 1956 has a phenomenon named after him that he never intended and eventually despised: The phenomenon describes the moment a shopper shifts from a purposeful errand into disoriented impulse browsing. The architect himself disavowed mall culture in 1978, and his words were memorable. "I am often called the father of the shopping mall. I would like to take this opportunity to disclaim paternity once and for all. I refuse to pay alimony to those bastard developments." A major furniture retailer perfected this approach with their forced one-way path through roughly 300,000 square feet of showroom. A university researcher explains the psychology as a process where delaying the shopper's ability to fulfill their mission while simultaneously disorienting them from everyday life causes them to feel licensed to treat themselves once they're finally allowed to start buying. The retailer actually tested non-maze layouts in some locations and reverted because shoppers preferred the maze. Now move online. The foundational pricing trick is the Decoy Effect, first documented by Huber, Payne, and Puto in 1982. Adding an option that nobody would rationally choose, but that makes another option look better, by comparison shifts purchasing dramatically. A behavioral economist tested this with real magazine subscription pricing, where three options were web only at $59, print only at $125, and print plus web at $120. 84% chose print plus web, but when the Decoy print only option was removed, print plus web dropped to 32% and total revenue fell by roughly 43%. Free shipping thresholds tap into what researchers call the goal gradient effect. Researchers showed in 2006 that the closer people get to a goal, the harder they push to reach it. That you're $8 away from free shipping, Progress Bar isn't informing you, it's accelerating you. Industry data shows 81% of consumers will add items to their cart to hit the free shipping threshold rather than pay the fee. The pain of paying, which we touched on earlier, plays a massive role in online retail design. Researchers at MIT ran a real auction for basketball tickets in 2001, and participants told to pay by credit card bid up to 100% more than those told to pay cash. 100% more for the exact same tickets. Credit cards don't just delay payment, they neurologically reduce the pain signal that would otherwise stop you from spending. A major online retailer grasped this deeply. Their one-click patent, filed in 1997 and granted in 1999, was built on one insight. Every additional step between wanting and buying is a moment where the insula, the pain of paying center, can fire and stop the purchase. Remove the steps, remove the friction, remove the pain. Research found that members of the retailer's premium subscription spend roughly double what non-members spend annually, around $1,400 versus about $600. That's not convenience alone. That's the systematic elimination of every psychological brake on spending. One more mechanism ties all the others together, and that's emotion. Researchers Cynthia Kreider and Jennifer Lerner ran an experiment in 2008 where participants watched either a sad film clip or a neutral nature documentary and then reported how much they'd pay for a water bottle. Sad participants paid roughly 300% more, and they had no idea sadness was driving the markup. The effect traced back to self-focus, because sadness narrows attention inward, and purchasing temporarily restores a sense of personal control. A 2013 follow-up study by Lerner found that sadness also makes people more present-biased, meaning they'll accept less money now rather than wait for more later. Sadness literally devalues the future, which is a brutal combination when you're standing in front of a checkout screen. And here's the twist. Retail therapy actually works, at least in the short term. A University of Michigan researcher ran 3 experiments and found that making shopping choices, even hypothetical ones, reduced residual sadness more than just browsing. 79% of people making choices reported feeling more in control compared to just 2% of browsers. The mechanism was restored personal control, not the purchase itself. But the relief fades fast and the cycle feeds itself. A lending survey of about 2,000 Americans in 2023 found that 69% said emotions drive their spending, with 39% of those emotional spenders reporting it had pushed them into debt and 71% experiencing guilt or regret afterward. A credit survey found that 54% of Americans would rather spend on retail therapy than actual therapy. Compulsive buying exists on a spectrum, and the far end looks like this. A 2006 study surveyed over 2,500 U.S. adults and estimated that 5.8% meet criteria for compulsive buying behavior, which translates to roughly 1 in 20 adults. The gender gap turned out to be far smaller than commonly believed, 6% of women versus 5.5% of men. Clinical samples skew heavily female, but that's because women seek treatment more, not because they're more affected. Brain imaging of compulsive buyers by Robb and colleagues in 2011 found exactly the pattern you'd predict from everything we've covered. Stronger activation in the nucleus accumbens when viewing products, and weaker activation in the insula at price presentation. Stronger wanting with weaker braking, the same circuitry with the dial turned up. So here's where we stand. Your brain's reward system chases anticipation. Anchoring distorts your sense of what things should cost. Loss aversion makes the fear of missing out more powerful than the benefit of saving. The Diderot Effect turns one purchase into 10. Social media has turned the entire world into your reference group. And the retail industry has spent billions engineering every possible friction point out of the space between wanting and buying. What actually works to interrupt these patterns? Not folk wisdom, not just have more willpower, but what researchers have tested and measured? The strongest evidence-based intervention is called implementation intentions, developed by psychologist Peter Gollwitzer. These are if-then plans, not vague goals but specific pre-commitments. Instead of "I'll spend less," the format looks like, if I feel the urge to buy something online, then I will close the browser and write down what I wanted and why. Gollwitzer and Sheeran's 2006 meta-analysis across 94 independent tests, with over 8,000 participants, found a medium to large effect size, and in 2020, Van de Ven and colleagues tested if-then plans specifically for impulse buying and confirmed they reduced impulse purchases in the lab. The mechanism is elegant. You delegate the decision to a pre-made plan, so when the trigger hits, the response is already loaded. You're not fighting the impulse in the moment because you made the decision before the impulse arrived. Second, increase the pain of paying. Credit cards can double willingness to pay versus cash, and the lower the payment transparency, the greater the spending, with cash being the most transparent, then checks, then credit cards. You don't need to carry only cash everywhere, but for categories where you overspend, adding any friction at all helps. Delete saved credit card numbers from websites, remove one-click purchasing, and use a browser extension that adds a waiting step. Every moment of friction is a moment for the insula to catch up to the nucleus accumbens. Third, add a waiting period. And I want to be upfront about this one. I didn't find a peer-reviewed randomized trial specifically testing a 24-hour or 30-day waiting rule as an anti-spending intervention. It's folk wisdom rather than experimentally validated in that specific form. But the theoretical basis holds up. Research on the hot-cold empathy gap established that people in calm cold states fail to predict how strongly aroused hot states will distort their preferences. Shopping while excited, sad, stressed, or bored puts you in a hot state, and waiting lets you return to a cold one. The FTC actually codified a version of this in 1974 with a 3-day cooling-off period for certain sales, not because they tested it psychologically, but because the pattern was obvious enough to legislate. Fourth, reduce exposure to comparison triggers. The science on this remains mostly correlational rather than causal, since nobody has run a randomized trial testing whether unfollowing influencers reduces spending. But the supporting evidence is strong. A 2020 study showed that deactivating a major social platform improved well-being and reduced subsequent use, and the Philadelphia Fed lottery study proved that visible consumption by neighbors directly causes financial distress. If exposure drives the comparison and the comparison drives the spending, reducing exposure is the logical intervention. Fifth, watch for bridging goods. Once you understand the Diderot effect, you can spot the chain before it starts. The most dangerous purchase isn't the expensive one, it's the one that creates a new unity. A new couch doesn't cost what the price tag says. It costs the couch, plus the rug, plus the throw pillows, plus the end tables, plus the lamp that now doesn't match. Before buying the first item in a new category, ask yourself what else it will make you want to replace. Sixth, and underneath everything else, pay attention to what's actually happening in your brain when you feel the urge to buy. Researchers found in 2012 that compulsive buyers showed significantly lower mindful attentional focus, and separate research found that dispositional mindfulness correlated with lower materialism. The research remains mostly correlational, but the direction is consistent. People who are more aware of their internal states spend more deliberately. Researcher Wendy Wood at USC, who has studied habits for decades, found that roughly 43% of daily behavior is repeated in the same context, automatic rather than deliberated. Her key insight cuts to the core of this entire video. The good effects that we popularly ascribe to self-control are more accurately described as situational control. People who appear to have great self-control don't actually resist temptation more successfully. They arrange their environment so they encounter less temptation in the first place. That's the real takeaway. This isn't about being stronger. It's about being smarter with where you put yourself. Here's what I want you to carry out of this video. Everything we covered, dopamine, anchoring, loss aversion, the Diderot effect, social comparison, retail engineering, and emotional spending, these aren't abstract theories. They are the specific mechanisms acting on you every single day, in every store, on every app, and on every product page. And now you can see them. That's the bridge between psychology and finance that most people never cross. Financial literacy usually means knowing how compound interest works or what an index fund is. But the most expensive financial mistakes people make aren't about misunderstanding products. They're about misunderstanding themselves. Understanding your own psychology is a financial skill, and it might be the most important one you ever develop. All 6 of these mechanisms share one thing in common. They work best in the dark. Anchoring works because you don't notice the anchor. Loss aversion works because the urgency feels real. The Diderot effect works because each purchase seems independent. Social comparison works because the envy feels like aspiration. And the entire architecture of modern retail, from store layouts to one-click purchasing to free shipping progress bars, works because it was designed to be invisible. But you've seen it now. You know the dopamine lives in the chase, not the catch. You know the crossed-out price is there for your brain, not your benefit. You know that only 3 left is a loss aversion play, not a logistics update. You know that one new thing will try to bring 10 more with it. You know your feed is an engine of upward comparison. And you know that every piece of friction removed between you and a purchase was removed on purpose. None of this can be unseen, and that's your advantage. Not willpower, but awareness. The patterns haven't changed, but now you can see them coming, and that changes everything. I'll see you in the next one.